again, I'm Altheimer. How y'all doing this afternoon? How y'all doing? First, I'd like to express my gratitude towards y'all for coming and joining us at this year's summit. Your presence here is highly appreciated. It shows and proves that the work being done thus far is not going unheard. Last year's summit, an issue raised was the lack of adequate preparation inmates are receiving prior to release. That's an upsetting fact that not only cripples an inmate's successful reentry back into the community, but I believe is most likely unknown to the community and their tax dollars. I think if this fact was known, then a cry for the prisons we already have that start actually reforming will be yelled, instead of the usual request for longer sentences and more prisons. For repressing a person's ability to commit crimes by locking them up does not curb the thinking errors that leads to those behaviors. Correcting and reforming one's behavior takes more than just incarceration. So maybe we should start looking at correcting DOC's tactics to reform us. Because one must understand that by DOC failing to sufficiently target the misbehaviors, then failing to properly prepare an inmate for release, ultimately leaving them with the same limited opportunities made worse due to their convictions. These are all ingredients in a recipe of disaster, a disaster which usually leads to recidivism. Now, I've contributed to the statistics of recidivism, so I can't blame anyone else for the bad taste of that recipe since I'm the one that cooked it. Therefore, I must take full responsibility for my irresponsible actions. Bad choices that led to devastating results. Hence, I would like to take this opportunity to apologize to all I've affected, including the victims, the family, my family, and you all, the community. My sincere apologies. In hopes of soon being able to more effectively prevent recidivism, I give this presentation. Because quite honestly, what's being done now isn't working. I was recently reading a news article that quoted a 2007 study by Washington Institute for Public Policy, and noted that community-based employment and job training combined with drug treatment saves society $13,359 per participant by reducing recidivism. Granted, job training and drug treatment is most definitely needed to help lower recidivism. And DOC has no problem dishing out drug treatment in these prisons. But focusing attention on one component of the problem does not fix the problem as a whole. Thus, I believe it to be imperative DOC starts to address all of the needs and problems, all through an inmate sentence from the very beginning, as well as follow-up programs once released. From personal experience, out of the 730 days of my last incarceration, the time spent on actual reform can be summed up in 30 days or less. Successful reform as well as successful reentry back to the community takes more than a few crash courses right before release. I was sentenced to a specific amount of time incarceration. Nowhere in my judgment and sentencing does it sentence me to be a fool. Therefore, don't ask me to believe that a man who's lacking in education and job skills can be taught years' worth of experience in a few weeks prior to release. It's not going to happen. Now, I've had countless discussions with other men such as myself in BPC meetings as well as outside of them, who've experienced being released and returning, as well as men soon to be released for the first time. And a familiar trend of answers were given when asked what were and are some of the biggest obstacles one faces prior to release as well as when released. A few of the issues brought up were employment, education, housing, and counseling. The first of these issues being employment, which is obviously a big one. Due to the fact most men not having the proper skills or any skills needed to get a sustaining job, which is strange considering men are spending countless hours, months, years, even decades behind these prison walls working for DOC. Many hours spent doing jobs such as cooks, electricians, plumbers, and carpenters, just to name a few. Yet even after working these jobs, inmates are still being released, unable to use their job training or apply them as any kind of certifiable hours. Now it can be argued that work release helps inmates retain jobs before they are fully released. But what about the men in close custody or the men who just don't meet the requirements? Then the privilege of work release is not an option. There should not be any standards to meet in order to go to work release, nor should it be a privilege. If anything, it should be required every prisoner spend the last part of their sentence at work release. Now, some of you all might say, there's not enough room. Well, why aren't we spending money on work releases instead of more prisons? Now, the next issue brought up is education. Well, I should have said it lack of. It's not uncommon for DOC to ignore education other than the GED basic skills. You then have a few limited options, including a computer class. Other than that, nothing. Now, I must admit, Monroe is an exception to this common trend. Monroe has continued to let the BPC create new voluntary classes through the university behind bars. At the time of last year's summit, we only had 3 classes: African American history, sociology, and business class. But since then, I am happy to report that we've been able to add psychology, film history, creative writing, math, personal finance, and political science. Keep in mind, these classes are not mandatory and are strictly run by our sponsors and volunteers. And the waiting list for the inmates to get into these classes are in some cases over a year long. But Monroe is the only prison I know of in Washington State that allows this chance at a higher education, ultimately giving those of us who participate a sliver of hope before we get released. Now, the third issue I'll briefly be speaking on is housing. It's not uncommon for landlords to be highly skeptical or discriminate against altogether when faced with renting to a freshly released prisoner. And those who are willing to rent are usually located in areas where temptation is not only around every corner, but usually at our front doorstep. Then the men with long criminal histories of violence on their record aren't allowed to be placed on the lease of the majority of the rented properties their loved ones may be renting at, especially if those loved ones get assistance. This problem ostracizes us from those who are willing to help, leaving a number of men trapped in prison past their early release date until they can get approved addresses or until they reach their maximum incarceration date. In those cases, making their earned good time obsolete. Another problem that could prospectively be fixed or avoided altogether with work release. Now, the last issue that was unwillingly spoke upon, due to the fact that most men don't want to admit needing it, was some all-around counseling. This subject is, I believe, the most important, yet the most neglected. Because while prison is home to untold amounts of traumatized men with no way to deal with their pain or mental anguish, other than, as Mr. Sherrill noted earlier, $33,000 worth of medication doled out each day to these inmates. I think it's safe to say that a couple days worth of medication would be better spent on a group therapist salary.